Most people will spend their entire working life chasing a version of success that was never designed to include them. They will wake up early. They will work late. They will sacrifice weekends, relationships, sleep, and still, at the end of it, they will not understand why the wealth never arrived. Nobody told them the truth at the beginning, because the truth does not sell dreams. The truth is uncomfortable. The truth is brutal. And the truth, once understood, is the only thing that has ever separated the builders of empires from the people who simply work inside them. I learned this the way most people learn anything that matters, too late to avoid the pain, but early enough to use it. Years ago, before any of this, I stood inside a small retail shop I had poured nearly everything I owned into. Shelf half-stocked. A ledger that never balanced the way I wanted it to. A landlord who didn't care about my dreams, only my rent. Nobody warned me that owning something would feel less like freedom and more like exposure, like standing in an open field during a storm, fully responsible for every drop of rain that fell. That shop taught me more about wealth, power, and human psychology than any book ever did, because theory doesn't argue with you when the electricity bill is late. Reality does. So when I tell you what follows, understand this is not theory recited from a stage. This is extracted from friction. This is what the floor of a business actually feels like, stripped of the polished language people use to describe it after they've already won. Somewhere right now, someone is quitting their job, convinced that freedom is one business plan away. They believe hard work guarantees reward. They believe revenue equals wealth. They believe the people who love them will cheer the loudest. They are wrong on all three counts, and the market will teach them this lesson whether they are ready for it or not. This is the story of what nobody tells you when you start, and why the entrepreneurs who survive are not the ones who work the hardest, but the ones who understand something the rest never do. Let's destroy the illusion first, because illusions are expensive, and you've already been paying for this one without realizing it. You were taught, somewhere along the way, that effort is the currency of success. Work hard enough, long enough, and the universe settles its debt. It's a comforting story. It's also false. Effort without strategy is not virtue, it's waste. Throughout history, the builders of fortunes, from the merchant houses of Renaissance Florence to the industrial dynasties of the 19th century to the founders reshaping markets today, understood a principle the average person never learns. Output without leverage is just motion. You can row a boat with everything you have and still drift backward if the current is against you. Hard work matters, but hard work was never the variable that made the difference. Strategy was. I rowed that boat. 12-hour days behind a counter, restocking shelves myself, doing the accounts myself, locking the gate myself at night because I couldn't afford to pay someone else to care as much as I did. For a long time, I mistook exhaustion for progress. I thought if I just pushed harder, the numbers would eventually agree with my effort. They didn't. The shop survived not because I worked the most hours, but the week I finally sat down and asked a different question. Not how do I work harder, but what is actually broken in this system? That single shift in posture, from laborer to architect, changed everything that followed. This is the first fracture in the illusion. The second is more dangerous because it touches something deeper than ambition. It touches identity. You were told that nobody is coming to save you, and you nodded along, assuming you already understood it. You don't. Not really. Because what that sentence actually means is this. There's no longer a boss to blame, no manager to absorb your mistakes, no system catching you when you fall. The moment you choose ownership, you choose total exposure. Self-discipline stops being a personality trait and becomes a survival mechanism. Accountability stops being a buzzword and becomes the air you breathe. Every entrepreneur who has ever built something lasting has had to confront this same realization in private, usually somewhere around month 4, when the excitement fades and the silence sets in. The silence where no one is clapping, no one is checking on you, and the only person enforcing your standards is you. I remember that silence specifically. The first 3 months, adrenaline carries you. People ask how it's going. You feel like a founder. There's a story to tell. Then month 4 arrives, and the story goes quiet. The customers who said they'd come back didn't. The supplier who promised reliable delivery missed twice in 1 week. Nobody calls to check on you, because to everyone else, you've already become the one who owns the shop now, a settled fact, not an ongoing struggle. That gap between how people perceive your situation and how unstable it actually feels from inside it is where most entrepreneurs quietly break. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow erosion of belief, alone, with no one to report it to. Centuries ago, the merchant elites who built trading empires across oceans understood something the modern employee still doesn't. They called it self-sovereignty, the recognition that wealth flows toward those who govern themselves before they attempt to govern markets. A man who cannot discipline his own hours will never discipline business. A man who cannot hold himself accountable in private will collapse the moment accountability is required in public. This is not motivational language. This is operational law. The market does not care about your intentions. It responds only to your behavior, repeated consistently over time. But this is where things become dangerous, because once you accept that nobody is coming to save you, a second illusion tries to take its place. The illusion that working harder will compensate for the absence of strategy. It won't.
This is the second brutal truth, and it is the one that bankrupts the most talented people in any industry. Hard work alone is not enough. You can pour 16 hours a day into a business that is structurally flawed and still fail, because effort cannot fix a broken model. It can only delay the diagnosis. The entrepreneurs who actually build wealth are not the ones grinding the longest hours. They are the ones who identified, early, that the real leverage points were never in more work. They were in solving real problems, in mastering sales, in understanding marketing as psychology rather than decoration, in acquiring customers efficiently, and in building systems that function without their constant presence. I didn't believe this at first. I thought systems were for businesses bigger than mine, something you build later, once you've made it. That belief cost me months of unnecessary suffering. The truth is the opposite. Systems aren't a reward for success. They are the precondition for it. The day I wrote down on a single sheet of paper exactly how inventory should be ordered, exactly how cash should be counted at close, exactly what a good customer interaction sounded like, that was the day the shop stopped depending entirely on my physical presence. It was small. It was unglamorous. But it was the first brick in something that could eventually outlast my own exhaustion. Think about what a system actually is. A system is stored intelligence. It is a decision you made once, encoded into a process, so that you never have to make that decision or pay that price in time again. The untrained mind sees systems as bureaucracy. The strategic mind sees them as compounding leverage. Every hour you spend building a system is an hour you are buying back, infinitely, into the future. Every hour you spend simply grinding is an hour you spend once and never see again. This is the quiet mathematics of wealth, and almost nobody explains it this clearly because explaining it requires admitting that most effort, by itself, is simply effort spent, not effort invested. And this is only the beginning. Because once you understand that strategy outperforms labor, you have to confront the next truth, the one about money itself, the one that destroys more businesses than bad ideas ever do. What happens next changes everything, because this is where most people discover, too late, that the number on their bank statement and the health of their business were never the same thing. There is a particular kind of fear that only entrepreneurs understand. It is not the fear of failure in the abstract. It is the fear of a specific day, 3 weeks from now, when a supplier invoice is due and the cash that was supposed to cover it has already been spent on something that looked, at the time, like growth. I lived inside that fear for the better part of a year. The shop was doing more business than ever, more customers walking in, more product moving off the shelves, numbers that, on paper, looked like success. And yet I was constantly, quietly, terrified. Because revenue was rising and cash was disappearing, and nobody had ever taught me that those two things could move in completely opposite directions at the same time. This is the third brutal truth, and it is the one that kills businesses that look, from the outside, like they are winning. A business can generate enormous sales and still go bankrupt. Revenue is vanity. Profit is sanity. Cash flow is survival. Say that to yourself slowly, because it is not a clever phrase. It is a description of how the entire economic machine actually functions beneath the surface story everyone tells about growth. Growth without cash discipline is simply a faster way to run out of money. You are not building a business at that point. You are accelerating toward a wall. I learned this the way that leaves a mark. I had expanded too quickly, bought more stock than the shop's actual cash position could safely support, convinced that more inventory meant more sales meant more success. For a few weeks, it felt that way. The shelves looked full. Customers commented on the variety. And then the bills arrived, stacked on top of each other, due within days of one another, while the cash from those increased sales hadn't fully cycled back yet because credit terms, slow-paying regulars, and seasonal dips had quietly eaten the buffer I thought I had. I remember sitting with the ledger late at night, doing the same subtraction 3 times, hoping the third attempt would produce a different number. It never did. That night taught me, permanently, that the only question that matters in business is not, how much am I selling, but how much cash do I actually have access to right now, today, and how long can I survive if nothing new comes in? Centuries ago, the great merchant elites understood this instinctively because they operated in a world without safety nets. No business loans engineered to rescue the careless. No institutional cushion for poor cash discipline. A trading house that ran out of liquid capital simply ceased to exist, regardless of how impressive its warehouses looked. The elites who survived for generations were not the ones who chased the largest deals. They were the ones who never let their reserves fall below a certain threshold, who treated cash the way a general treats ammunition, never spent carelessly, always tracked, always positioned for the next confrontation. Wealth, to them, was not the size of the empire. It was the depth of the reserve behind it. This is the psychological trap that destroys ambitious people specifically, not the cautious ones, the ambitious ones. Ambition convinces you that bigger numbers mean better outcomes. It convinces you that growth is always good, that more customers, more inventory, more locations, more hires are inherently signs of progress. But growth that outpaces your cash discipline is not progress. It is exposure dressed up as success. The entrepreneur who expands carefully, who tracks expenses with the same intensity they track sales, who understands their margins down to the smallest unit, who keeps a deliberate reserve for the months that will inevitably be worse than expected, that entrepreneur is playing a different game entirely. They are not optimizing for the appearance of success. They are optimizing for survival long enough to compound. And compounding is the only thing that has ever created real wealth. Not single wins. Not lucky quarters. Survival, repeated, across enough time for advantages to stack on top of each other. I started tracking 4 numbers obsessively after that night at the ledger, and I would tell anyone starting out to do the same. Expenses, every single one, no matter how small, because small leaks sink large ships slowly enough that you don't notice until the water's at your knees. Margins, not just whether something sold, but what it actually earned after every cost was subtracted, because a high-volume product with a thin margin can quietly bleed a business dry while looking on the surface like the star performer. Customer acquisition cost, what it genuinely takes in money and effort to bring in a paying customer, because if that cost exceeds what the customer is worth to you over time, you're not acquiring customers, you are purchasing losses. And monthly cash reserves, the buffer between your business and collapse, measured not in optimism, but in actual days you could survive with 0 new income arriving. This is where identity starts to shift, and I want you to notice it happening in real time. The employee thinks in terms of salary, a fixed number, predictable, disconnected from the deeper mechanics of how money actually moves through an organization. The owner thinks in terms of flow, how money enters, how it's held, how it's deployed, how quickly it returns. The employee asks, did I get paid this month? The owner asks, did the business generate more cash than it consumed, and if not, why not? And for how long can that imbalance be sustained before it becomes fatal? This is not a difference of vocabulary. It is a difference of consciousness. One person is reacting to a number someone else decided. The other is engineering the number itself. Power, in business, is rarely loud. It is rarely the person making the most noise about how busy they are. Real power sits quietly behind a ledger, tracking, adjusting, positioning. Leverage is not motion. Leverage is precision applied at the right point in a system. The entrepreneur who understands this stops measuring their day by how tired they feel and starts measuring it by how much closer their cash position moved toward stability and growth. That single change in measurement is the difference between a business that survives its first hard year and one that doesn't. But here is where things become dangerous in a different way, because once you've mastered the numbers, once you understand strategy over labor and cash over revenue, you run directly into the fourth brutal truth, and this one is not financial. This one is human. This one will cost you relationships before it ever pays you a single dollar in return. Most people never realize what happens next because the next obstacle doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It shows up at the dinner table, in the voice of someone who loves you, asking why you're still doing this when it would be so much easier to just get a stable job. There is a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It is the loneliness of standing inside a vision nobody else can see yet, surrounded by people who care about you deeply but who are, often unconsciously, trying to pull you back towards safety. I felt this acutely in the early months of running that shop. Relatives who had watched me leave a more predictable path would ask, gently at first, and then less gently, whether I had thought this through. Friends who once asked excited questions about the business started asking fewer questions altogether, not out of malice, but because watching someone struggle is uncomfortable and silence is easier than honest engagement with someone else's risk. This is the fourth brutal truth, and it is the one that breaks people who are otherwise fully capable of succeeding. Most people will not support you, not because they wish you harm, because belief, for most human beings, is retroactive. People do not believe in a vision before it exists. They believe in outcomes after they've already happened, when belief no longer requires risk, when supporting you costs nothing because the proof is already sitting in front of them. Friends may doubt you. Family may question you. People may laugh at your ideas, quietly or openly, and this reaction is not a referendum on the quality of your vision. It is simply what happens almost universally to anyone who tries to build something before its outcome is guaranteed. I want you to understand the psychology underneath this, because understanding it removes its power over you. Human beings are status-regulating creatures. We constantly, often unconsciously, calibrate our own position by comparing it to the people around us. When someone close to you takes a risk you haven't taken, it creates a subtle discomfort, not because they wish you to fail, but because your risk implicitly raises a question about their own choices. If you succeed, it suggests a path they didn't take. If you fail, it quietly confirms the safety of the path they did take. This is not cynicism about human nature. It is simply how status psychology operates beneath the surface of nearly every relationship, and elites throughout history have understood it with a clarity that most people never develop. They did not expect external validation before taking calculated risk. They expected isolation, and they built their resolve around that expectation rather than around the hope of avoiding it. I remember the exact week the doubt nearly broke me. Sales were slow. A relative had just made a passing comment about how, at least with a steady job, you'd know what you're earning, and I sat alone in the shop after closing, genuinely questioning whether I had made a foolish decision. That night was not won through motivation. It was won through a single, cold realization. Their doubt was not evidence against my plan. It was simply the predictable output of people evaluating my situation from outside the information I actually had, the projections I'd run, the adjustments I'd already made, the slow but real signs of improvement they couldn't see because they weren't looking at the ledger every night the way I was. Doubt from people who are not in the arena with you is data about their perspective, not a verdict on your strategy. This is where the identity transformation accelerates, because the moment you stop requiring external belief before you act, you cross a threshold most people never cross. The consumer waits for permission. The builder grants it to themselves. The follower needs consensus before committing. The strategist commits first and lets consensus arrive later, if it arrives at all. This is uncomfortable to hear, because we are trained from childhood to seek approval from parents, teachers, peer groups, social feedback loops that reward conformity and punish deviation. But wealth, real wealth, structural wealth, has never been built by people who waited for unanimous approval. It has been built by people who learned to tolerate disapproval long enough for results to arrive and speak on their behalf. Centuries ago, the elites who built lasting fortunes operated with a kind of quiet detachment from popular opinion that would look, by modern standards, almost cold. They were not seeking to be liked. They were seeking to be accurate, accurate about markets, accurate about risk, accurate about timing, and accuracy, more often than people expect, requires positions that look foolish or even reckless to outside observers in the moment they're taken. The person who buys when everyone is selling looks irrational until they're proven right. The person who builds quietly while others mock the effort looks naive until the structure is finished and undeniable. This is not a coincidence. It is the price of being early to anything that eventually works. I think often about the specific texture of that early isolation because it is rarely discussed honestly. It is not dramatic. Nobody storms out. Nobody delivers a cinematic speech of disapproval. It is quieter than that. Fewer phone calls, shorter conversations, a slight change in tone when people ask, "How's the shop going?" And you can hear, underneath the question, that they expect you to eventually admit defeat. Learning to sit inside that quiet, without needing it to change before you continue, is one of the least discussed and most decisive skills in entrepreneurship. It has nothing to do with talent. It has everything to do with psychological endurance. Trust your vision before others do. Not because other people's opinions don't matter at all, but because timing matters more than consensus. By the time everyone agrees with your direction, the opportunity that made that direction valuable has usually already been captured by someone who moved while the doubt was still loud. This is the uncomfortable mathematics of being early. You will be alone in your conviction for longer than feels reasonable, and that aloneness is not a sign you're wrong. It is frequently a sign you're simply ahead of the information other people are still waiting to receive. Notice, too, what this isolation does to your relationship with control. The person who needs constant external approval has handed a piece of their decision-making power to everyone around them. Every doubtful glance becomes a vote against your own judgment. Every skeptical comment becomes a tax on your confidence. But the person who has made peace with being misunderstood retains something most people never get to keep: full ownership of their own mind. That ownership is not arrogance. It is the foundation beneath every act of genuine leverage, because you cannot build something the world hasn't seen, yet if you require the world's permission to keep building it. But conviction alone will not protect you from what comes next, because even the most psychologically resilient entrepreneur will eventually face the fifth brutal truth. And this is the one that determines, more than any other single factor, who actually survives long enough to build something that lasts.
And that's where the real game begins, because the fifth truth is not about avoiding pain. It's about what you do with it once it arrives, and it always arrives. Every successful entrepreneur has failed. Not occasionally, not once, as a footnote in an otherwise smooth story. Repeatedly, substantially, in ways that felt at the time like the end of everything they were building. I had a product line in that shop that I was certain would be the thing that changed our trajectory. A small expansion into a category I thought the local market was hungry for. I sourced it carefully, priced it thoughtfully, displayed it prominently. It failed almost completely. Months of capital sat on those shelves, slowly becoming a daily reminder of a decision that hadn't worked. Failed products, failed ideas, failed launches. This is not the exception in entrepreneurship. This is the baseline condition of building anything that hasn't been built before in your specific context. This is the fifth brutal truth, and it is in many ways the most important one because it determines whether everything you've learned so far gets the chance to compound. Failure is part of the process, not a sign that the process is broken, not evidence that you should abandon the path. Simply the tuition required to access the knowledge that eventually makes success possible. The difference between people who build lasting wealth and people who don't is rarely talent, and it is rarely luck. The difference is simple, and it is almost insultingly simple once you see it clearly. Most people quit after failure. Entrepreneurs learn, adapt, and keep moving. I want to slow down here because this distinction is usually stated as a slogan, and slogans don't change behavior. What actually separates these two groups is not willpower in the abstract. It is the specific mental operation performed in the minutes and hours immediately after a failure registers. The person who quits treats the failure as information about themselves. proof that they are not cut out for this, that the dream was unrealistic, that they should have known better. The person who adapts treats the same failure as information about the system, proof that a particular approach, a particular assumption, a particular piece of the strategy didn't hold up against reality and therefore needs to be revised. Same event, two completely different interpretations. And the interpretation, more than the event itself, determines what happens next. When that product line failed, I had every emotional justification to take it personally. I had chosen it. I had believed in it. Its failure felt, for the first few days, like a referendum on my judgment as a business person. But underneath that emotional reaction was a more useful question, and eventually I made myself ask it. What specifically did I get wrong? And what does that wrongness teach me about the actual shape of demand in this market? The answer wasn't comfortable. I had built the decision on what I personally found impressive, not on what the customers walking through that door had ever actually asked for. That single correction, building from observed demand instead of personal taste, became one of the most valuable lessons that Shop ever extracted from me, and it only arrived because the failure was expensive enough to demand attention. Failure is often expensive education, and I mean that literally, not poetically. Every failed product, every failed campaign, every failed hire, every miscalculated expansion. These are tuition payments to a curriculum that has no other way of teaching you. No book can fully substitute for the specific, personal cost of watching your own capital evaporate because of a flawed assumption you didn't know you were making. The elites who built enduring fortunes across history were not strangers to this tuition. They paid it repeatedly, often at scales far larger than anything most people will ever risk, and the difference between them and the ones history forgot was not that they avoided failure. It was that they refused to let any single failure become the final chapter of the story. This is where power becomes psychological rather than financial. Control, in the deepest sense, is not control over outcomes. Nobody has that, regardless of wealth or status. Control is the ability to determine what a setback means. The untrained mind hands that meaning-making power over to the event itself, allowing the failure to dictate despair, withdrawal, abandonment of the entire pursuit. The trained mind retains authorship over meaning even in the middle of loss, asking not what does this say about my worth, but what does this reveal about the system, and what is the next intelligent move available to me? Think about what this actually requires psychologically, because it is harder than it sounds in a single sentence. It requires separating your identity from your results at the exact moment your results are telling you something painful. It requires treating your business decisions the way a scientist treats a failed experiment, with curiosity about the data rather than shame about the outcome. Scientists do not abandon their entire discipline after one failed experiment. They record what happened, adjust the variable, and run the next test. Entrepreneurship rewards this exact posture and punishes its absence with a consistency that should be studied more carefully than it is. I think about the people who never reopen after their first real failure. Not because they lacked ability, but because they let one bad season convince them that the entire pursuit was a mistake. The market is, in this specific sense, indifferent to talent and obsessed with persistence. It does not reward the most gifted entrant. It rewards the entrant who remained in the game long enough and adjusted enough times for the gap between effort and skill to finally close. This is not an inspirational claim. It is closer to a mechanical one. Skill compounds through iteration, and iteration requires survival, and survival requires that you do not let any single failure terminate your participation in the process. There is also a colder, more strategic dimension to this truth that rarely gets said out loud. Failure is not just tuition for you personally. It is also information that your competitors do not yet have, and that gap is itself a form of leverage. The entrepreneur who has already failed at a particular approach knows, with certainty, what doesn't work in their specific market, under their specific conditions, with their specific customers. That knowledge is not available in any book because it is hyper-local and hyper-specific to your situation. Every failure, properly extracted, converts into a kind of proprietary intelligence that your untested competitors simply do not possess. This reframes the entire emotional experience. The failure was expensive, yes, but it also purchased something nobody else in your market currently owns. But most people will hear all of this and still misunderstand what it requires, because they will think the lesson is simply don't give up, and that's not quite it. The deeper lesson is about what kind of person you are becoming through each of these confrontations, and that brings us to the identity shift underneath everything we've covered so far. Every truth we've walked through, the absence of rescue, the insufficiency of pure effort, the primacy of cash over revenue, the inevitability of isolation, the necessity of failure, is really describing the same transformation from 5 different angles. It is the transformation from employee to owner, from consumer to investor, from follower to builder, from reactive to strategic. These are not separate skills you acquire one at a time, like badges. They are facets of a single underlying shift in how a person relates to risk, time, and responsibility. The employee outsources responsibility upward to a structure that absorbs consequence on their behalf. The owner internalizes responsibility completely because there is no structure above them left to absorb anything. The consumer spends to feel something now. The investor spends to build something that pays them later, repeatedly, without requiring their constant presence. The follower needs a map someone else has already walked. The builder draws the map while walking it, accepting that some of those lines will need to be redrawn. The reactive person responds to whatever the day presents. The strategic person decides in advance what the day is for and lets the day's chaos arrange itself around that decision rather than the other way around. I did not become any of these things quickly, and I would be lying if I told you the shift happened in some single dramatic moment. It happened in increments, mostly invisible, mostly unglamorous. It happened the week I stopped restocking shelves myself and trained someone else to do it correctly, even though training them took longer than just doing it myself that one week. It happened the month I started reviewing the ledger every single night instead of only when something felt wrong. It happened the day I stopped needing a relative's approval before making a decision about the business they didn't fully understand. None of these moments would make for an exciting scene in a film, but stacked together across enough months, they produced a person who related to the same shop completely differently than the person who had opened its doors. This is the part almost nobody tells you clearly. The business is not really the thing being built. The business is the forge. The actual product being produced slowly through every cash crunch, every doubtful relative, every failed product line, every 16-hour day that didn't move the numbers is you, a version of you with a different relationship to fear, to discomfort, to delayed gratification, to your own judgment. People chase wealth as if it were the destination. Wealth is actually closer to a side effect. The real destination is the identity required to generate and protect wealth once it arrives, because without that identity, money evaporates as fast as it appeared. This is precisely why sudden windfalls so often disappear within a few years, while businesses built slowly through this exact kind of forging tend to compound and persist. The money was never the asset. The person who became capable of producing it repeatedly under pressure was the asset all along. Status, in the world most people inhabit, is borrowed, a job title, a salary bracket, a brand of car, all of it rented from systems that could be altered or removed by someone else's decision. Power, in the world the strategist inhabits, is owned, built from internal discipline, from financial literacy, from psychological endurance, from the accumulated proof of having survived and adapted through real consequence. One can be taken from you in an afternoon. The other can only be eroded by your own neglect. Positioning matters here in a way that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The strategist does not simply work hard inside their circumstances. They actively position themselves relative to the market, relative to competitors, relative to timing, the way a chess player thinks several moves ahead, rather than simply reacting to whatever piece was just moved. Every decision in that shop eventually stopped being a reaction to the day's events and started being a deliberate placement, where to position inventory ahead of a season, which supplier relationship to deepen before a shortage hit, which slow-moving category to quietly phase out before it became a larger liability. This is leverage in its purest form, positioning yourself so that time and circumstance work in your favor rather than against you, instead of constantly scrambling to respond after the fact. Influence, too, shifts meaning once you've crossed into this identity. The employee thinks of influence as something exercised over them, a manager's instruction, a company's policy. The owner begins to understand influence as something they generate. Over customers through trust earned consistently, over suppliers through reliability demonstrated repeatedly, over their own future through patterns of behavior compounding silently in the background. None of this requires charisma in the conventional sense. It requires consistency applied long enough that people, markets, and circumstances begin to organize themselves around your reliability. Ask yourself, honestly, which side of each of these pairs you currently occupy. Are you thinking like an employee, even if you technically run something of your own? Waiting for permission, blaming external circumstances, treating your business as a job with extra stress rather than an asset under construction? Or are you beginning to think like an owner, tracking cash with obsession, treating doubt from others as irrelevant data, treating failure as tuition rather than verdict? This is not a question with a comfortable answer for most people, and it isn't supposed to be. The discomfort of the question is precisely the mechanism by which the identity shift begins. What happens next changes everything again, because once you've absorbed all 5 truths intellectually, the real test is whether you can hold them simultaneously under actual pressure. Not in a quiet moment of reflection like this one, but in the middle of a bad week, when every one of these lessons is being demanded of you at once. I want to walk you through what that actually looks like, because abstraction is easy to nod along with and hard to apply. Picture the week everything goes wrong simultaneously. The week a key supplier delivers late, a competitor undercuts your pricing, a piece of equipment breaks that you can't immediately afford to replace, and a relative chooses that exact week to ask, again, whether this was really the right decision. This is not a hypothetical designed for drama. This is closer to the median experience of running something real over a long enough timeline. The 5 truths are rarely tested one at a time, politely, in sequence. They tend to converge. In that kind of week, the person still operating from an employee psychology looks for someone to blame. The supplier, the market, bad timing, bad luck. The person operating from an owner's psychology looks for the next available lever, because blame produces nothing except temporary emotional relief, while identifying the next lever produces an actual path forward. The person still needing external validation collapses internally the moment the doubtful relative voices, once again, what they've been thinking all along. The person who has already made peace with isolation registers the comment, lets it pass through without anchoring to it, and returns attention to the ledger, the supplier relationship, the actual mechanics of the problem in front of them. This is the moment where strategy and psychology fuse into something that looks, from the outside, like calm. Not because nothing is wrong, because the person has trained themselves to separate the emotional noise of a bad week from the actual decisions that week requires. Calm, in this context, is not the absence of pressure. It is the presence of process under pressure, a set of internalized questions that get asked automatically, regardless of how loud the surrounding chaos becomes. What is my actual cash position right now? What is the next highest leverage action available to me today? What does this specific failure teach me about an assumption I was making? Whose doubt is relevant information, and whose doubt is simply noise from outside the arena? I remember a week almost exactly like this in the shop's history, and what carried me through it was not confidence. I want to be honest about that, because the cinematic version of this story would have me feeling certain the whole way through, and that would be a lie. What carried me through it was a kind of discipline that didn't require confidence to function. I didn't feel certain things would work out. I simply kept performing the next correct action, repeatedly, because the alternative, stopping, guaranteed a worse outcome than continuing under uncertainty. This is an underrated form of power, not the power of feeling unstoppable, the power of acting correctly even while feeling uncertain, because you've decided in advance that your actions will not be hostage to your temporary emotional state. Discipline, understood this way, stops being a moral virtue you either have or lack, and becomes something closer to an engineered habit, a set of pre-decided responses to predictable categories of pressure, built during calm moments so they're available during chaotic ones. The strategist does not decide, in the middle of the crisis, whether to check the cash position. That decision was made months earlier, encoded into a nightly habit, so that during the crisis there's one less decision competing for limited attention and willpower. This is the same logic as the systems we discussed earlier in this exact script, applied now to your own behavior rather than to the business's external operations. You become, in a very real sense, a system you've designed for yourself, preloaded with the correct responses to the categories of pressure you've already learned to expect. This is also where freedom, the actual kind, starts to reveal itself as something different from what most people imagine when they picture entrepreneurship. Freedom is not the absence of obligation. The owner of something real has more daily obligation, not less, than most employees ever experience. Freedom, in this context, means something more precise: the freedom to determine which obligations you accept, which risks you're willing to absorb, and which version of your future you're actively building toward, rather than having all three of those determined for you by someone else's decisions about your role, your hours, and your ceiling. The employee's freedom is bounded by someone else's structure. The owner's freedom is bounded only by their own discipline, their own cash position, and their own willingness to keep adapting after failure. That is a harder freedom. It is also, for the people who actually want it once they understand the trade, the only freedom that compounds rather than depreciating with time. Ownership, ultimately, is not a legal category. It is a psychological posture that precedes the legal paperwork by months or years, and without that posture, the legal paperwork is just a document. I knew people who technically owned businesses and still thought, felt, and reacted exactly like employees, blaming circumstances, seeking approval, treating failure as identity rather than information. Their businesses, predictably, struggled in ways that had little to do with the quality of their products and everything to do with the psychology operating the controls. And that's where the real game begins for you specifically, watching this right now, because everything described so far has been diagnosis. What remains is the harder question, not whether these 5 truths are accurate, but whether you are willing to let them restructure how you actually move through the next year of your own life. Let's be precise about what's actually being asked of you, because vague calls to action produce nothing except a brief emotional spike that fades by tomorrow morning. The first truth asks you to stop waiting for rescue and start building self-discipline as if your survival depends on it, because eventually, in some form, it will. The second asks you to stop mistaking exhaustion for progress and to redirect at least some of your energy from pure labor toward strategy, towards solving real problems, toward understanding sales and marketing as psychology rather than decoration, toward building the systems that let your business function without your constant physical presence. The third asks you to develop an almost obsessive relationship with your actual cash position, tracking expenses, margins, acquisition costs, and reserves with a discipline that has nothing to do with how exciting your revenue numbers look on the surface. The fourth asks you to make peace in advance with the fact that most people around you will not understand your decision before the results arrive, and to build enough internal conviction that their doubt does not function as a veto over your direction. The fifth asks you to treat every failure not as evidence of your unworthiness, but as tuition paid toward a curriculum that has no other way of teaching you, and to keep adjusting rather than quitting after the bill comes due. None of this is comfortable. I am not going to pretend it is, because the entire premise of this script has been refusing comfortable lies in favor of brutal accuracy, and it would be a strange betrayal to end on a softer note than the one we started with. But discomfort, properly understood, is not a sign you're on the wrong path. It is frequently the exact texture of being on the right one, early before the proof exists yet to make it feel safe. I think about the version of myself standing in that shop in the early months, exhausted, doubted, financially stretched thinner than felt survivable, with absolutely no guarantee that any of it would eventually work. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I would not offer comfort, because comfort would have been a lie at that stage and he would have known it. I would tell him what I'm telling you instead. The discomfort you're feeling right now is not a malfunction. It is the specific, identifiable sensation of becoming someone capable of holding more responsibility than you currently believe you can hold. That sensation does not go away once you succeed. It simply becomes familiar enough that you stop mistaking it for danger. Power, real power, the kind that compounds across decades rather than evaporating after a single good year, is built almost entirely out of decisions made during exactly this kind of discomfort. Decisions to check the ledger one more time when you'd rather not look. Decisions to keep showing up to a vision nobody else has validated yet. Decisions to extract a lesson from a failure instead of a verdict about your own worth. Nobody sees these decisions from the outside. They are invisible individually, the way a single brick is invisible inside a finished wall. But they're the only material wealth has ever actually been built from. Everything else, the headlines, the highlight reels, the curated story told after the fact, is decoration applied to a structure built, brick by invisible brick, in exactly this kind of unglamorous discomfort. Control over your own life, in the deepest sense available to a human being operating inside an uncertain economy, is not control over outcomes. Markets shift. Competitors emerge. Circumstances refuse to cooperate with your plans regardless of how carefully you made them. What remains controllable in every single one of those conditions is the quality of your response, whether you default to blame or to leverage, whether you require external validation or have built enough internal conviction to proceed without it, whether a setback becomes a closed door or simply expensive information that sharpens your next move. This is the only form of control that has ever actually existed for anyone at any level of wealth in any era of history. The elites who built lasting fortunes did not control the markets they operated in any more than you control yours. They controlled, with unusual discipline, the quality and consistency of their own response to conditions they did not choose. So here is where this ends, and where, more importantly, something else begins, because a script like this one is only valuable to the extent that it changes what happens after the screen goes dark. Most people will watch something like this, feel a brief surge of clarity, maybe even conviction, and then return completely unchanged to the exact routine they were living in before they press play. This is not a criticism of those people. It is simply the most statistically common outcome, and naming it honestly is more useful to you than pretending otherwise. Insight by itself changes nothing. Insight that gets converted into a specific repeated behavior. Checking the cash position nightly, building one small system this week instead of doing the task manually again, sitting with one piece of doubt from someone you love without letting it dictate your next decision. That is the only kind of insight that has ever produced a different outcome for anyone in any industry at any point in history. A small number of people watching this will actually do something different starting today. Not something dramatic. Probably something small enough that nobody around them will even notice the shift has occurred. They will look at their own situation, their job, their side project, their half-built business, their Curiana store, or their channel, or their quiet ambition they haven't told anyone about yet, and they will ask, honestly, which of these 5 truths they have been avoiding. Maybe it's the ledger they haven't looked at closely enough. Maybe it's the system they keep meaning to build, but haven't, because doing the task manually feels easier in the short term, even though it's more expensive in the long term. Maybe it's the validation they're still quietly waiting for from someone who, statistically, is unlikely to give it before the results already exist. Maybe it's a failure they've been carrying as a verdict on their own worth, instead of extracting it as the specific, valuable lesson it actually contains. Decide, right now, which one applies to you, because vague resolve dissolves by tomorrow, and specific identification does not. Not which one applies to entrepreneurs in general, not which one sounds the most profound in the abstract, which one is true specifically of your actual situation today. That specificity is the entire difference between watching something like this and being changed by it. I think back often to that shop, to the version of the ledger that never balanced the way I wanted, to the relative's comment that nearly ended things during a slow week, to the failed product line that taught me more than any success that followed it. None of it felt, at the time, like the beginning of anything coherent. It felt like survival, day by day, decision by decision, often without any confidence that the decisions were correct. It was only much later, looking backward, that the pattern became visible, that each of those uncomfortable moments had been quietly building the exact identity required to handle what came after. This is almost always true in retrospect and almost never obvious in the moment, which is precisely why so many people abandon the process exactly when it's closest to compounding into something real. You are either going to close this and return to the same patterns you were living in an hour ago, or you're going to take one specific, concrete action today that reflects what you've just walked through. Not someday, not once things feel more stable. Today, in whatever form is actually available to you right now. Opening the ledger you've been avoiding, writing down the first version of a system you keep doing manually, sitting with a piece of doubt without letting it change your direction, or extracting the actual lesson from failure you've been treating as a closed chapter instead of an open curriculum. Wealth was never going to arrive because you wanted enough. It arrives when it arrives at all, as the structural result of an identity that has absorbed these 5 truths deeply enough to act from them automatically, under pressure, without needing comfort or consensus first. Most people will hear this and return to their routine. A small number will act. Decide today which one you are.